Wow! Yes, boys, yes, we are back and we're doing kamaKAZI, Washington, Heaven, and Murph. Or Girth. Now, this is kamaKAZI Washington's second album and truly a sister to his last, The Epic, with many paralleling choral rudiments, familiarity in motifs and song structuring, yet an introduction of many other elements that keep this album fresh and wholly unique from that one. As ever, comparisons to Pharoah Sanders and Albert Ayler are imminent from anyone who is eager to box this bloke in, but this incorporates freewheeling Coleman as much as it does Cool Davis. Not to mention a bossa nova sensuous flair in percussion, unique vocal elements, Horace Silver, Latin bop, boring choral vocals as well, touches of Ethiopian jazzy keys, vocoders, Gustav Holst strings, and a Herbie Hancock fucking fusion of synthesizers, among many other moving parts. Those Herbie Hancock synthesizers, thankfully though, are appropriately buried onto the mix. Mind you, when they aren't like on Street Fighter Mass, man does it feel funky and a fun departure, especially with the comparatively threadbare percussion keys and the cruisy sax work drilling underneath this track. It's delicious and it keeps the last leg of this album feeling fresh even more despite the fucking choral vocals. And there are quite a lot of these palette cleansers scattered throughout the fucking 17-hour epic over here, thank God, so that it isn't just KamaZi's brash, rasping tenor sax solos providing the melodic edge of every track. Whether that be Testify, a little baby song comparative to the others at 5 minutes in runtime where the female vocals are used as a deliberate focal point, or Connections, which features this electric shimmering Jimmy-esque guitar solo cruising through the ending passage whilst the percussion descends into even more ambitious feels, which happens to be a very necessary contrast considering how rudimentary the SimCity 4 cool elevator jazz sax motifs sounded at the beginning of this track. The only thing really saving them there being the alternating guitar licks in the first place. Can You Hear Him features another kind of a solo, this time keys, which at points sound like a dolphin trying to fuck an Atari soundtrack with the same kinds of harmonic forays as KamaZi's repetitious licks on the tenor sax. Not to mention other moments here where it feels like an ambulance siren on acid. The second disc here though features KamaZi Washington's most diversified soundscapes, no more apparent than the Space Traveler's Lullaby, whose strings really do give it a symphonic edge. There's a lot of subtle layering, details and swelling, mind you. I still found it to be a little formless and needlessly drawn out on repeated listens. The track after, V Lua V Soul, as well features the most delicious double bass on the album, and the clinking percussion is a great backdrop for what must be called a questionable use of a vocoder. I mean, again, it's a palette cleanser technically, I guess you could say, just maybe not a very good one. Now, as I hinted at before, KamaZi's methodology to songwriting has always contracted degrees of divisiveness from some purists, and that is for the indulgent song and album lengths and what they would also call less than adventurous structures with recycling of motifs with not enough variation. It is no secret that, like his last album, he draws out his motifs as though for the sole purpose of consoling a sea turtle. Yet I would argue he succeeds almost without exception despite this consideration, as the sheer layering, attention to detail, and morphing of reprisals keep every composition motoring on. I am fairly convinced that the structuring and variations are actually more adventurous and not as predictable as some people make out, maybe compared to Ascensions and Spiritual Unity or something like that, yeah sure, but I still feel like some expectations placed on this record come from a place of resentment for contemporary jazz and its so-called ersatz emulations. Of course, I resonate with the criticisms of this being overwrought and needlessly bloated at times, but almost every song puts me into a groove I don't ever want to leave. A kind of fluidity and compositional flow that rinses out the tiredness from me bones. It's the kind of album that transforms cleaning a pool into a formative experience. It's truly trance-like and formulated for that express purpose. Obviously, if you're not as liable to the soothing touch and crave for jazz with a more direct, condensed styling, this just might aggravate you for a lot of its duration. but I think it's perfectly within the spirit of jazz and music moreover to have freewheeling forays and flowing epics even at the runtime of 3 hours. Or even fucking 36, I mean that's probably the length of this album anyway, isn't it? Of course it's not always the lengths as much as it is how they are filled, but I don't think it's possible to make an argument saying the palette isn't diverse or as all-encompassing as it could possibly be without sacrificing the technical lushness imbued. I will definitely linger here though, because occasionally some sax passages like on the opening and closing motif of Tifo Conque one-on-one and Connections feel too opaque and devoid of imagination. Connections also happens to be one of the most glaring examples of shitty choir intervals used to bridge transitions together. And these are definitely moments where the fat should have been trimmed at least a little, because the saturation of the sax on this album of this length is only a good thing when it's melodically rich or bound together with technicality. It's not like you have to force yourself to sit through the entire record either. It's yours to enjoy over as many sittings as you want. I mean, it's not exactly a fucking Nuremberg rally. And the quality is undeniable, and I don't think he gets enough credit from some people for the smoothness of transitional movement, production choices, and the instrumental talent and complexity shown here. Does it match note for note Coltrane's spellbinding and irreplicable examples set in Ascension and Meditations, or the coolness with which Davis toured his fusion masterpieces of Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way? Are their individual band members as talented and uniquely fascinating as the people that colored those records? No! But for contemporary jazz, it's a fucking fantastic trip into some of the best soundscapes that have so far colored this genre, not to mention the furthering of his own. I personally would have loved maybe a little more batshit insane free jazz and less rigidity at times. It's also true that there is repetition in his pentatonic fucking E minor licks, something which he should really change up and build from. But his solos are still as expressionistic as they've ever been, even despite some criticisms for not building the solos with a sense of linear or harmonic purpose. The visceral and ear-grabbing energy is undeniable here. But yeah, please Kamasi, just get rid of your fucking choral elements entirely for the next record. I don't want to hear them again. They're just so consistently flat, gaudy, and unimaginatively used. They derail the vacuum of jazz for me, an embellishment that only detracts from the experience at most points. Fucking Jesus Christ, man. But I really do love the first 3 tracks here. Their seamless transitioning, the funky and involved percussion, but most of all the squirrely sax passages which remain to be so melodically dense and raw at times. No more obvious than hub tones. I mean, the percussion is sensuous with these popping dynamic layers here. And goddamn, that drum solo that slides through the 7-minute mark is a punchy interlude and a skeletal contrast, yet with still enough technical details to keep the ear involved into the closing passage of those squirrely saxes. It all feels very spirited and vibrant, the composition as tight and as lush as it ever has been. And the sax has that freewheeling cool flair, delivering what feels like an improvised performance with a healthy dose of reverb at stages whilst the piano dances underneath. Now, despite my overwhelming love for this album, there are flaws and discernible lulls in the track listing and drawn out boring fucking sax motifs at times that feel especially familiar. Not to mention it goes further in its showy, gaudy exterior at times like the vocoder, and not to mention the somewhat affected religious themes. But nonetheless, this is rich, rewarding, and even more ambitious than the epic, so I'm liable to give Kamasi some slack at times. 4.2 for me, boys, 4.2. I can't wait to actually see him step up his soloing in the next project maybe, and go even further into different production choices and soundscapes, and that is definitely one of his main strengths, not to mention, you know, trim a little bit of fat maybe. And fuck off with the choirs. Okay, that's my fucking review. Tell you what, boys, loved it. Fucking loved it. As if that was any surprise. I mean, his last record was a fucking classic, and this is just great as well. So there you go. Too easy. Just have fun. I appreciate new subscribers, likes, feedback, and whatever the fuck. So just have a good one, man. Wow!